Michigan beats Washington 24-7, outscoring the Huskies 17-0 in the first half, which I find to be pretty impressive given that Washington was leading the nation in points scored in the second half, at least leading the Power Four in that category. And Michigan was able to cover the -4.5 line. They outscored Washington 17-0 in the second half, and they controlled the lines of scrimmage, and they actually outplayed Washington on a quarterback basis. Who would have thought that? Not just entering the year, but especially given the history between these two teams recently, where Washington had Michael Penix and Michigan had J.J. McCarthy. Last year, Washington had DeMond Williams Jr., subbing in at times and eventually starting at the end of the year over Will Rogers. Michigan had Davis Warren or Jack Tuttle or Alex Orji, kind of a collection of homeless people at quarterback. And Michigan has a true freshman this year. Washington has a more experienced true sophomore who's been in his offense and in his system for, over a year now. And he has better receivers than what Michigan does. And yet, Michigan's quarterback, Bryce Underwood, went 21-27 for 230 yards, 8.5 yards per pass attempt, and 2 touchdowns. And there were a lot of short passes, a lot of dump-offs, and that's good. But there were also some throws where he threw it into double coverage only to where his receiver could catch it, and it was never going to be picked unless it was bobbled. He made some cross-body throws that I thought were very impressive. He had some true freshman mistakes, like running out of bounds when it was 2nd and 5 and it turned into 3rd and 11. But then he hit his tight end, the reliable Zach Marshall, for I think or maybe it was Deacon Tonelli, one of the younger tight ends, for a big play that got Michigan in range to eventually score the touchdown that put them up 21-7. With Bryce Underwood passing to Zach Marshall 10 yards for a touchdown, where they used Andrew Marsh out of the backfield to confuse Washington's man coverage, where they motioned him from the right side to the left. That got Washington safeties to move, and wide open is Zach Marshall in the end zone for a touchdown. It was a really nice win for Michigan. I said to myself as I was watching the game that if Michigan were to win by double digits, that would be at least good for them. And that if they just won the game, it wouldn't have been all that great, but a win is a win given the bounce back spot, given you don't have Justice Haynes and your starting left tackle goes down in the game. But that none of those things really mattered here. All it did was prevent Michigan from winning in a more dominant fashion. I mean, if they have Justice Haynes, maybe they convert that 4th and 2, or some of their drives don't stall out. Maybe Washington's defense never gets off the field if they have Haynes. I think it was a good test for Michigan's offense to see what they could do, and I thought that Chip Lindsey called a really solid game. Thought he did a really good job. And Martindale, he called a good game too. It was Michigan's best coached game, I would argue, in the entire Sherrone Moore era. Much better than Nebraska, who I think the power ratings tomorrow will say that Washington is better than on a neutral field. Didn't give up a Hail Mary pass. The passes that could have been Hail Marys, you usually forced Washington to stall out in the red zone, or you picked them off. That's what Michigan did. They outgained Washington 417 to 249. They outgained Washington in rushing yards 187 to 40. They had a +3 turnover margin. They only had 2 sacks, but they had 7 tackles for loss, in addition, dominating Washington at the lines of scrimmage. And much like Ohio State with Matt Patricia, Michigan with Wink Martindale decided that they didn't want to over-pursue and let Williams get down the field with his legs. Williams ended the day with -19 yards rushing, similar to what he ended against Ohio State, where both of these defenses that have a massive talent edge over most of Washington's offense was able to keep everything in front of them for the most part, though they did get burned once on a deep pass, actually twice, including that busted zone that Washington exploited. Well, it wasn't a busted zone, but Williams put the ball in perfectly to his receiver. And then the final interception where Denzel Boston almost catches it. There's something with Michigan's defensive backs where they don't know how to take good angles and they don't know how to high point the football, and they're pretty bad at it. But Boston drops it because it is a hard catch to make to adjust, and there's Odin right underneath to at least have the awareness to make the interception. It was a good day for Michigan and for that team and that coaching staff. It's a rough day for Washington. However, given the 9 a.m. local kickoff and the lines of scrimmage mismatch and the fact that you're only walking away with 2 losses, you're 5-2, you should theoretically win out until the Oregon game, or maybe you win out but drop. You win out outside of one game. You should be 9-2 or 8-3, maybe 7-4 at the very worst entering the Oregon game, and you already have a better regular season record than you did last year. That's something to be proud of, I think. Washington's not a bad team. They're a good team. They're a top 30, top 25 team, like a fringe top 25 team. And Michigan, I think, showed today that they can be a top 15 team and are certainly a top 20 caliber team. That fourth quarter, that late third quarter, but for the entirety of the fourth quarter was vice grips by the Michigan defense, by a rushing offense that had struggles without their home run hitter Haynes. Never had a run longer than 17, and that was Underwood on the final drive of the game, pulling it on a zone read. Michigan averaged 4.7 yards per carry for 187 yards and a touchdown. They only allowed 2 tackles for loss, independent of the sack that Uyunglele had on Bryce Underwood earlier in the game. Really good effort by Michigan. I mean, that's really all I can say here, just from the overview of the game. When you have 37 minutes and 30 seconds of possession, and it felt like Michigan, really from, I would say, the second quarter, was the better team than Washington, but Washington was staying in it, and then Michigan's able to pull away. They left a field goal on the board, or off the board, with Zvada. They left a touchdown off the board with Morgan dropping that fourth down. They left another field goal or potentially a touchdown off the board with some very questionable blocking on that 4th and 2. Good play by Washington, though, to force the blocking to be questionable. There were so many more opportunities for Michigan to score points where they didn't compared to Washington. If this game is played again, it is probably worse for Washington. It's a bigger win for Michigan. And to have that after USC out-physicaled you and turned you into a pulp, an orange pulp, that's a good response. 23 first downs to 14. I want to shift the conversation about this game to both of these teams' futures, because this was really a college football playoff elimination game. I said that in my preview. That's what this was going to be, especially for Michigan entering with 2 losses. Washington is, in theory, alive, but they would need to win out. And I don't know if I trust them to win out based on what I've saw in their performances against Ohio State, Michigan, Rutgers, and Maryland. You know, their games against Power 4 Big Ten competition. I don't know if I trust them to do that. That would take Washington making some improvements in key areas and also playing essentially a perfect game against Oregon and hoping that Oregon messes up in certain areas for them to win out. But let's take a look at these schedules here and then get to some of my key takeaways. So the first is Michigan's schedule. So Michigan wins over New Mexico and Central Michigan in the non-conference, lost to an Oklahoma team that just earned bowl eligibility by really vice-gripping South Carolina on the road. That's a good win, good response to the Texas loss. Michigan in conference beat Nebraska on the road, who stands at 5-2. They beat Wisconsin at home 24-10, where Ohio State, I think, they're already up 10-0 on Wisconsin at this point. Makes sense, though. Wisconsin's kind of quit, and Ohio State, just from style of play, can much more easily get up on teams like Wisconsin than Michigan can with those awesome wide receivers, elite defense, and just really elite everything about them. But Wisconsin's 2-4 right now. They're going to be 2-5, 0-4 in Big Ten play after that game. The loss to USC, 13-31, was not pretty, but beating a 5-2 Washington team 24-7, Michigan has beaten Nebraska on the road and Washington at home, and these are 2 teams that more likely than not will finish with 8 wins or maybe even 9. And in theory, given what's left on their schedule and the opponents and where they're being played, one of those teams could finish with 10 wins. In theory, I don't think they will. So Michigan has 2 quality wins, 2 quality losses. Their remaining schedules at Michigan State, Purdue at home, Northwestern and Maryland back-to-back road games, then Ohio State at home. What you need if you're Michigan is to see continuous improvement from Bryce Underwood, to see the rushing attack continue to improve. I thought today, especially at the end of the game, you got to see Michigan respond in a unique way that we haven't seen from them all year in terms of power running. And Washington analytically has a good run defense. It's not great. It's a little bit inflated, but they were able to give Marshall enough space, get like 3-4 yards of push, maybe at times more than that later in the game. So that was encouraging to see. The D-line, as expected, ate up Washington's O-line, but better than that, I think they were able to really contain Jonah Coleman because they improved at tackling. They said they were going to after the USC game. You don't always know if coach speak is true or not. Well, in this instance, it was true. Their tackling was better. They were a much more fundamentally sound team today than really they have been at any point all year. I would argue that is why this is Sherrone Moore's best win from a coaching and game plan angle of his entire career at Michigan so far. The Ohio State game is circled, but this team, based on style of play and their limitations, can't afford to overlook anyone remaining on their schedule. The hope is you win out and you play Ohio State tough and hopefully beat them. That's realistic. I can see this team going anywhere from 8-4 to winning out and going 10-2 after what I watched today. For Washington, on the other hand, sort of similar thing. I would say I can see them going anywhere from 8-4, 9-3. I don't think they're going to win out. Oregon has, I would argue, a much higher ceiling on the lines of scrimmage than either Michigan or Ohio State does. I think their defensive line can match either, and they are theoretically bigger there and also more athletic. And offensive line, it's not even close. They have better run blocking than Ohio State or Michigan, and in terms of pass protection, they do have their moments where they're iffy. I do think some of that, though, is the cost of having that big of an O-line. So there's a little bit of a trade-off there. And Dante Moore just does not have the elusiveness and pocket awareness of Julian Sayin. He may not even have what Bryce Underwood does, because that Indiana game was a really bad game from Dante Moore in terms of, his stature and awareness in the pocket. But Washington will be favored over Illinois, I think. They should beat them. They should beat Wisconsin. They should beat Purdue. In theory, they should beat UCLA on the road, even though it's a really tough road trip to make before Oregon at home. I think Washington drops 1 to 2 of their final 5 games and finishes 8-4 or 9-3. I just don't see how they're beating Oregon outside of rivalry crap happening. And the reason Washington owned Oregon when DeBoer was there is because DeBoer's one of the best game managers and best game day coaches and one of the best planning coaches in all of college football. They didn't own Oregon because they were in Oregon's head. They outcoached Oregon, and that's why they beat them 3 times in a row with DeBoer versus Lanning in 3 one-score games. So on top of having better personnel than this Washington team does, and I think Oregon, at least compared to their 2022 self, is upgraded at personnel. So I'm curious to see how that game turns out. Very curious. I would side heavily with Oregon there right now, but that's too far ahead into the future. I think if you're Washington, winning 8 or 9 games this year was always going to be a success, so I don't want to recalibrate expectations. This is a good team. They're well coached. I always kind of viewed them as more of a 2026 team or even 2027 team than a 2025 team, and I think in this game and the Ohio State game, you saw some of that. Finally, just want to remind you all to like, to share, subscribe, and hit the notification bell and comment your thoughts down below before we get to this final segment. And that final segment is some of my takeaways from this game. So Underwood had the best game of his career, 21 of 27 for 230 yards and 2 touchdowns, had some rushing yards on the ground. They're not running him a ton, and I like that. They're showing some things, like some zone reads. He's not pulling it a lot, and I like that. I think that if you can win without running him to death, that's good. I think you're probably going to need him to run and know how to run the ball against Ohio State if you want to win. granted some things in the Ohio State side. But it was a really good game. I mean, he threw lasers. He never really put the football in harm's way outside of maybe one play out of 27, which is incredible. He threw with great anticipation. He did overthink some things at times, like running out of bounds and taking a 5-yard loss when you should just throw it away. But it happens when he's a true freshman. He had a 177, I believe, passer rating, and I imagine his QBR was pretty high too. That number hasn't been updated yet, but to go 21 to 27 for 230 yards, 2 touchdowns, have 25 rushing yards, and only take 1 sack, that's a pretty good game, especially given the limitations we know all too well from the Michigan receivers. Morgan dropping that 4th and inches pass where it wasn't the perfect pass from Underwood, but if he catches that, and most good receivers do, he has 6. That was points left off the board for Michigan. That wasn't Underwood's fault. There were also drops from Michigan receivers later in the game that were not on him, that he threw pretty good balls for. There were some other passes where, too much air on the ball, too much zip, but he's a freshman. He'll learn those things eventually. Michigan only allowing negative 0.23 EPA per play to Washington's offense and 4.82 yards per play is really impressive. That's elite against this Washington offense. Now, keep in mind Washington at a 45% success rate, which isn't phenomenal, and they technically had a good expected points added per rush, but a lot of that has to do with Jonah Coleman being a good back, the rush standpoint, and the success rate also has to do with Jonah Coleman getting a few extra yards of push in a way most Big Ten running backs won't, and the fact that Michigan, much like Ohio State, said, okay, we'll let you move the ball in between the 20s here to at least get a sense of how the game is going, but we're not letting you score in the red zone. Michigan did once, and it was off of Williams having a beautiful drive, beautiful throws. And outside of that, Washington shanked a field goal. Washington, they also stalled out and had to punt when they were getting close to the red zone. They were just outmatched. They couldn't match Michigan at the lines of scrimmage, and because Michigan tackled well and played fundamentally sound, Michigan wasn't going to let them outmatch them through the air all that much. They did on a few big plays, but really outside of that, they locked down a very impressive Washington offense. Again, I think this is Sherrone Moore's best game as a coach so far, and they're imperfect. Washington is. Michigan is too. But Washington's an imperfect team, and DeMond Williams is an imperfect quarterback. Much like a lot of quarterbacks of his build and his style of play, he will try and hold on like too much to the ball and make things happen when sometimes he's got to throw it away. He did a better job of throwing it away and knowing when the play was dead than Underwood, but there were some other times where he's trying to get the ball out too quickly or force something when it isn't there, and that's how he threw 3 interceptions. Thank you so much for watching and for listening to my analysis and reaction to this Michigan versus Washington game. Michigan had a good win. Washington, it's a tough pill to swallow, but they're still a good team, and I imagine they'll bounce back. See you guys soon.